Thanks so much for joining us, listeners. My name is Elaine Howard Ecklund, and I am the author of Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear with Brazos Press. And I am joined today by Reverend Dr. Mark Labberton, who is president of Fuller Theological Seminary and has some questions about the virtue of doubt.
Well, let me begin by saying first, Elaine, just how much I admire your work, and that this book, I think, just continues to add to the resources that you're helping to create that change conversations, especially around faith and science. And the fact that the book turns on issues of fear in a way was fascinating to me, partly because I'm myself writing a book on fear.
Oh, good.
Permeating presence in our lives. And to some degree, in the same way as doubt, which I want to ask you about, fear is good and problematic. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have good fear that helps preserve us in various ways. But it's also the case that doubt has both really great strengths to its importance and challenges as well. And so we can't get by without measures of both. So I want to just ask you a couple of things about your thoughts about doubt. I think one of the great gifts of the book that I think is really important, and I want to just have you expand on, is why can faith and doubt happily coexist, and necessarily even coexist, when, as you know, for many people, they're seen as hostile enemies, and they are the opposite of each other and should be kept remote rather than actually understanding that they should belong together. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. I guess I would respond from the vantage point of two communities. So when I think about the science community, my husband's a particle physicist. I think I've told you in the past, I've hung around scientists a lot, especially physicists, a lovely bunch. I think doubt is almost universally looked at as a virtue in the scientific community, right? So we want to try to doubt our findings until we have more and more evidence. I've seen ways in the scientific community, though, where doubt can be quite crippling to particular groups of people. So I think about people who have been historically underrepresented and maybe marginalized in science. So think about there are very few Black physicists, for example. There are very few women of any racial group in physics. And sometimes those folks feel especially unsupported and self-doubting and reticent to go forward with their scientific findings. And so under that condition, doubt no longer becomes a virtue in science. That's what comes to mind. In the faith community, doubt is very personal to me. I would say that I was raised in the kind of faith community where doubt was definitely not viewed as a virtue. If you had doubts about faith or anything in the Bible, you were told resoundingly just to make a decision to believe. That's a narrative I hear often among the scientists I've interviewed who've walked away from their Christian faith. And I thankfully, a blessing, found faith communities later in life where there was a safe place to wrestle with doubt. I like the phrase someone mentioned to me once, safe doubt. So we want to create, I should think, faith communities where doubt can be wrestled with in safety, right? Without ridicule, to its fullest extent needed on the quest towards a deeper faith.
Well, I think what you're offering people there is really like a lifeline, nothing less than, in fact, a lifeline.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Because so often when we polarize these things, we fail to understand what the Bible is even teaching about doubt, and we also fail to benefit from the virtue of doubt in developing faith and in engaging with science. So I really applaud that, and I've been working for a long time on a book that I've called in my mind "Skeptical Believing: Possibilities for Knowing the God You're Not Sure Exists." Yeah. So I am very grateful for what you've written and feel like it helps to move that forward. I hope people will listen carefully to that. I think one of the other things around that area of safe doubt or healthy doubt, how does that positively contribute to our thinking about science. If we have healthy or safe doubt, and we're thinking now not so much of the faith domain, but the science domain, how do those two things come together? What is safe doubt in relationship to science?
So I find through my research in Christian communities that often learning more about science, particularly aspects of science which have been historically framed as being in tension with faith, so or with the biblical record. So we think about, an issue like evolution, and more recently, human reproductive genetic technologies. What do we do with embryos, for example? Um, and when we come to those issues, I want to encourage folks to wrestle with doubt within community. So um, here's where humility becomes very important. A Christian friend once said to me, a mentor, you really need to think often as an academic, God is God and I am not. And
Right.
I try to repeat that to myself several times a week when I remember that we need God. God is the only true knower, and we do not have to know everything. We definitely see kind of dimly right now. And that means that within community, we have a fuller representation of who God is. And so if I don't know the answer to a question, or I'm not the right person to sit with a person who has a struggle, um, I I have a I want very hard to try to find someone else who is. So I love the idea of us working together in Christian communities to support, especially youth and people who are coming along in the educational trajectory and really starting to wrestle with some doubts, especially those doubts related to science.
So one of the things that I think is extremely important about what you've just said is being able to embrace that kind of communal action that is both from the faith community, the science community, where they're the same and when they're different. I was moved, as I think others were perhaps at the time, that Harvard decided to change its school crest, which had always had three books in the crest. Two books were
Mhm.
open and one book was closed. And the idea was that there was a humble admission of, of the limits of human reason. When they decided to, I think it was on their one very significant anniversary, to turn the third book over, they were really saying, as now their crest expresses, that in one sense there is no limit to human knowledge, or there should be no limit. Now, I think we would agree that we don't want to suggest too early which book it is and exactly how closed it is, and use that as an excuse then for not continued honest investigation and doubt. But on the other hand, what you're suggesting is what I would argue is a really appropriate humility in the face of science and in the face of faith. And we see through a glass darkly, not transparently, and and all of that does suggest limits. How does that affect our understanding of doubt?
I love that you brought up the idea of humility, Mark, because um, humility, I think, or just acknowledging that I don't know now, is not the way that scientists and sadly even people of faith usually respond to hard questions that come from doubt. And I think to have the kind of humility which would allow one to respond that way can actually be very comforting to the questioner, to be a kind of relational model of how we might wrestle with doubt. I don't know now. I may come to a place later where I know more. I may never come to a place where I know fully in response to this question, but I'm open to change along the way. I think is a much healthier response than trying to damp down the hard questions, which ends up just cutting off exploration and cutting off creativity, right? Which are other virtues that are incredibly important when we start thinking about the intersection of faith and science.
Right. Thank you, Elaine. I'm grateful for this book and grateful for your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you for your work and who you are. Thanks so much.